Hello, I'm Matthew Ballard, Orleans County historian, coming to you from the Orleans County Department of History, and I would like to welcome you to episode 0 of Out of the Past, which is a new podcast that's going to be hosted by the Orleans County Department of History, and it's based loosely on a monthly column that I started writing in January of 2017. And that column, along with this podcast, are based off of a series of articles that were authored by Carrie Lattin in the 1960s, which appeared in the paper on a regular basis. And what Carrie Lattin would do is he would take snippets of articles from newspapers in previous decades and kind of assemble them all together for easy and enjoyable consumption by the community. So what I envision the intention of this, or the purpose of this podcast, is to take what I do on a regular basis and explore this more in detail. Kind of expanding upon my weekly columns from month to month, and taking some of the other pieces that I present on, or the tours that I give, or the other pieces that I write on social media, and diving more into those and providing some contextual aspects to build upon what I've provided to the community in a narrative form. So in addition to this, I would anticipate some sort of a piece that continues on with the mindset of the Out of the Past column, perhaps a segment entitled This Month in History, which examines some of the more interesting headlines throughout history. And as I move forward, we'll explore and test out some smaller segments to sneak in, but I want to keep the podcast short, so that it's not something that you have to sit down and listen to for an hour, because nobody wants to listen to me drone on for an hour. If you did, there are plenty of opportunities to come out and hear me speak at various places throughout the community. But for this, I'd like to keep it to maybe 20 minutes at the most, and just to give you an opportunity to hear a little bit more about what you're reading and seeing throughout the course of each month. So, how about a little bit of an introduction to myself? Because I don't know if I've ever really formally given an introduction of myself to the community. I've been historian for over 2 years now. I was appointed in February of 2015 to replace C.W. Lattin, who had retired after 36 long years as historian. And my interests in history go back probably to maybe when I was in the 4th grade. And those origins, those interests, started with county historian Bill Lattin. And I remember being in 4th grade, everybody sitting around in the school cafeteria and watching a slideshow that Bill had put together, highlighting the pioneer history of Orleans County and the development of the Albion area over the decades. So I carried that interest through high school, and after I graduated in 2006, I continued on to study history at the college at Brockport, and finally completing my Bachelor of Science in History in 2010. Then I continued on to the SUNY University at Buffalo, where I graduated in 2012 with my Master of Library Studies degree. And I focused my coursework at that point in time in academic librarianship and archives management. So I tried to carry on my interest in history even through my master's degree, which wasn't directly connected to my historical interests. But I never really got into the archives management portion of it. So as I'm currently working right now, in addition to my part-time duties as county historian, I'm working as the interim director of library services at Roberts Wesleyan College and Northeastern Seminary. Just recently, I'm kind of carrying on this interest in history, this passion for learning, and I enrolled in a graduate program at Brockport again, working towards my Master of Arts in American History. So that's just a little bit about myself, and I want to, as I'm kind of introducing this podcast today, this isn't going to be a normal run-of-the-mill thing that I'm planning on doing on a regular basis. This is just a kind of feeling it out, testing the waters, and I want to run up some upcoming events that are in the future here, in the very near future. And just a reminder to everybody listening that August is the regular cemetery tour month, I guess you might call it, in Orleans County. and has been the last few years. Every Sunday in August, starting at 6 p.m., the Department of History will host a tour at a historic cemetery in Orleans County. Now, traditionally, we've held these exclusively at Mount Albion Cemetery, and this year I'm looking to do something a little bit more daring, breaking out of that cemetery and kind of exploring some of the more perhaps remote or lesser-known cemeteries. So this year we're going to start out with some other Albion area cemeteries. I anticipate in the future we'll go beyond that and kind of explore other areas of the county. But anyways, for this year, August 6th, it will be at Mount Albion Cemetery. The group's going to meet at the chapel. August 13th, we're going to take a tour of the old St. Joseph Cemetery, which is located on Brown Road in the town of Gaines, just north of the village limits. And on August 20th, we're going to continue that narrative of the old St. Joseph Cemetery and carry that into the new St. Joseph Cemetery, which is located on East Avenue in Albion. And then to conclude the month, the final Sunday, on August 27th, we were going to take one more tour of Mount Albion Cemetery. And again, the group is going to meet at the chapel for that tour. Again, these all start at 6 o'clock. Groups will depart at around 6:05. Tour lasts about an hour and 10, hour and 15 minutes. Seems to be the sweet spot. Bring comfortable shoes, an umbrella just in case, because we're going to take these tours rain or shine. And if you're in the mood to hear a little bit more about the history of the canal after you sit through this podcast today, on September 5th at 7 p.m., I'm going to speak for the Oakfield Historical Society at the Oakfield Town Hall, and I was asked to come and give a presentation on the history of the Erie Canal as we celebrate the bicentennial. Now, some of you may ask, why would Oakfield be interested in the history of the canal? Well, the development of Orleans County, focusing around the Erie Canal, had an impact on areas surrounding it and throughout western New York. So we're going to share a little bit about how the canal impacted Orleans County in particular and grew the region throughout this area. So I want to segue, I'm talking on the subject of the Erie Canal, a segue into my first attempt at kind of diving into one of these articles or a couple of these articles that I've written over the last few weeks. Now, if any of you are familiar with what I've been up to lately, I just got married at the beginning of July, and then I took a 2-week honeymoon in Europe. So that whole experience kind of forced me to write some of these articles well in advance. And I thought it would be fitting for a number of reasons. One being that we're celebrating the bicentennial of the construction of the canal, which began on July 4th of 1817. But again, having to write these all together, it was nice to write a thematic series that could carry through July. So we started out with a general story about how the canal came to fruition and how the construction process took place. And then over the coming weeks, we kind of looked at some more minor incidents that impacted the expansion of the canal over the centuries following. We looked at an accident at the Hastings Gate, which is near Bates Road, just outside of Medina. And we took a look at the canal break that took place in Eagle Harbor. And we also took a look at the bridge collapse that occurred in Albion. And we also looked in the middle of there, we saw a photograph of a steam boat that operated along the canal. And so we see this kind of breadth of impact that the canal had. But there's more to be shared, I think, about the canal, and I think most would agree, than just the accidents and the little incidents that slowed traffic or impacted shipping along the canal route. So I wanted to take a look in more detail at the photographs from the first article written for July 1st. And I'm going to attach a link to this so you have an opportunity to pull this photograph up yourself and take a little closer look at it and maybe reread the article and then kind of listen to this episode and kind of pick up on some of the more minute details that appear in the photograph that I didn't perhaps write about. So what's prompting me to talk about this is I received I actually received a message from a gentleman, and not a phone call, and he was providing some comments and feedback about the article that appeared that week. Now, mind you, July 1st, I'm getting ready to head over to the church for my wedding, and I happened to read this message. Probably shouldn't have, but it was a comment that was along the lines of, the article the photograph that accompanied the article was a waste of time. And there wasn't any more of an explanation to this. So I responded to the gentleman and I asked, well, what about it did you find to be a waste of time? And when he responded to me, he said that the photograph in the newspaper just really didn't do the story of the canal any justice. And so at that point in time, I kind of understood what he was getting at. On the surface, a poor quality photograph in the newspaper doesn't do justice to the beauty of the canal. But in addition to that, and kind of deeper down, the photograph itself doesn't do justice to the enormity of the project that took place and the scale of the construction process that had to go into making this project come to fruition. So, looking at this photograph, my attention is drawn to the scale of the men who are standing at the base of this retaining wall. And there's a group of men who have gathered down at the foundation of the retaining wall that's being constructed to the east of Medina in this particular photograph. And they're just so small compared to the massive woodwork and the massive amount of cement that has been poured and is set at this point in time. The enormity and the size of the guy derricks that are constructed for the purpose of moving raw materials to the site. It takes some time to really put yourself in the shoes of those men who are working and to understand the seriousness of the project that's at hand. Now, in this photograph, you see the presence of steam equipment. And if you look along the left side of the photograph, you'll see a steam engine that's being used to push carts, which probably brought in stone or cement or other masonry materials and probably hauled out stone and debris and dirt as well. So you see the steam equipment in this photograph. But we think back maybe 100 years prior to this, when the men don't have steam equipment. They're using teams of horses and oxen and specially designed equipment to knock over trees and pull out the stumps. They're digging a 4-foot deep ditch that runs 363 miles from Buffalo to Troy. And when you hit the Niagara Escarpment just outside of the Middleport, Lockport area, and you have to climb through that rock that's there, the amount of effort that it took to complete this project is absolutely astounding. So I mentioned the steam equipment visible, and this is something that I really enjoy about photographs from the turn of the century. And you pick up on this quite a bit when you're looking at images from Medina, Holly, and Albion. We see the steam locomotive that's on the left side in this particular image, but we look down the hill to the right, and between the retaining wall and where the retaining wall is going to be constructed and the bank of the Oak Orchard River, we see a team of horses pulling a cart. So although all of this new equipment is available for use, it's being utilized, and all of this new technology and engineering work is being developed, you still see the presence of that age-old mode of transportation. So there's still a reliance on livestock and teams of horses to move and relocate resources and equipment. There's probably another purpose to this as well. If you look, kind of the terrain in that area is a little bit rough. There were tracks that were laid in that area. They're not visible at this point in time. So perhaps a locomotive wasn't able to maneuver in that area, and a team of horses a little bit more versatile and able to get into some difficult areas. Some of the more small, minute details that I think are interesting and worth picking up is there's a man standing up on the bank on the left side of the photograph, and he's standing there with a nice looking hat on. He's wearing a suit. Very few of the men down in the ditch are wearing jackets, and has his hands on his hips. So you can tell this gentleman has, just by his body language in the photograph, has some authority on this work site. So perhaps he's a supervisor, maybe he's a foreman, some sort of a contractor, and he's there clearly observing the work being done by the men down below and those that are up on the retaining wall. Another piece that I want to draw attention to, and this is probably one of the most important pieces in this photograph, is the presence of the packet boat that's traveling to the left in the photograph, traveling eastward out of Medina. Now, what you have to imagine is where this retaining wall is being constructed is the northernmost embankment now of the current canal. Now, where the packet boat is situated is the original path of the canal. Now, you're talking about a canal that's been widened from maybe 40 feet or so to about 70 feet. So that packet boat is traveling in the canal that had been widened in the 1840s, 1850s, and up into the 1860s. Where they're widening now, which is becoming part of the New York State Barge Canal system, is being widened from the 70-foot range to the 120-foot range. So again, this is just giving you a sense for the scale of this project that's taking place. So this packet boat is kind of up there in this small little section of the old canal, just a drop in the bucket of what would become the full scale size of the barge canal. And for those who are familiar with Medina's early history and some of the features and landmarks of early Medina history, you can make out the iron arch bridge that allowed for people to cross over the canal at Church Street. Now, when this widening project took place, that canal bridge was removed and was never replaced. And one final piece I think that's worth sharing about this particular story is the amount of, not just the scale of the job that's taking place, but the amount of work that went into making this happen, and not just on the actual digging of the canal itself, but what had to be brought in and what had to be set up and what had to be constructed so that the digging and the cement pouring could actually take place. And you'll see throughout this photograph, you'll see temporary tracks laid for locomotives. You'll see temporary buildings that were constructed, which were used to produce resources like cement. You might see temporary blacksmith shops that were used to shoe horses, and other buildings that were necessary to make it possible for these feats to be completed. So, if I'm correct, we shared two photographs on this particular article. And the second one is a little bit further to the west, and it shows the White House, or the White Hotel, which is clearly visible in the background. It's arguably the most iconic structure in Medina during this period of time. We see one of those temporary two-story wood structures that was used to manufacture resources like cement in the center of the photograph. We see the Church Street Bridge again. We're a little bit closer in this photograph. You can see the approach is clearly visible. And what I want to call to attention just very quickly in these two, in this picture in particular, is the amount of earth that has to be moved after this retaining wall is completed. And you can see that the earth to the south, which would be to the left in this photograph, is quite high up in relation to the retaining wall's height. Now the canal is being deepened from about 7 feet to 12 feet, so there's maybe 5 feet of earth that has to be excavated and relocated and removed from the job site. And if you look over to the right in this photograph, there are mounds of earth that are just kind of sitting off to the side, and those types of resources have to be removed from the job site before any traffic can come back to the canal. I think the other thing worth pointing out here too is in this photograph, what you're looking at is effectively the old site of the Empire Couch manufacturing plant, which would have been around in this vicinity. So when the canal came through after 1910, they're scoping out the different areas along the canal and trying to figure out which buildings and properties have to be purchased so that the widening can take place. This is one of the sites that's identified, and the Empire Couch Company is paid over $13,000 for their land and buildings, to which they relocate to Orient Street near Short Street. And then these buildings that were here were raised to make way for this retaining wall. So I do have an article that I wrote this year about the Empire Couch Company, and you can see a photograph looking to the east of the buildings that were there. So you can kind of put this together in your head and just imagine the amount of work that had to take place to make the expansion occur in around 1913, 1914. And we're not even taking into consideration the initial construction project from 1817 to 1825, and then the subsequent expansion that took place starting in the 1830s. So today I think we take for granted the canal and what the canal offers to our communities. The purpose of the canal is not what it used to be. So we see tourist traffic now. We see bicycles on the towpaths. We don't see barges and packet boats pulled by horses. So although the purpose has changed, I think the impact that the canal can have and continues to have on New York State is a very important one. So I think it's very fitting that today we talk a little bit more about the history of the canal and how important it is, and how important it has been to the development not only of New York State, but Orleans County as well. So I want to thank everybody for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this, and I would appreciate any feedback that you have to offer. I'm hoping that you're following the Department of History through our Facebook page and other social media outlets. You can visit my website, www.orleanscountyhistorian.org, and there are some opportunities for you to connect with me on that website as well, either by email or by phone. And I would encourage you to reach out and share a little bit of feedback on this idea. Share some ideas on what you'd like to hear about, and we'll move forward from there. So thanks again for joining me today, and stay tuned for the next episode.